Okay, so what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to I've got this story engine that I'm building, and we're going to do a little bit of work on that. The current state of things. Let me show you it running. I don't know. I can't remember what the last thing is that I shared with the stream. So we still have this, which I've had since the beginning. And then it goes into this thing, and this is just like a developer mode printout. So these are not things that I've written as content for the game, but just um, it filling in behavior where I haven't written any content. So I built sort of a overarching structure, and that has some like developer automated. It has some ways to fill in the labels and render it all for development purposes. So I can see the structure that I've built, but it doesn't. It does not like represent real content that I've built or anything. It's just a fallback, right? In a final game, you wouldn't want that to show up unless you were intentionally exposing like a developer mode interface. So that's what it looks like right now. And since I don't think this has been on stream yet, let me show you the way I'm specifying out my story graphs right now. So this is a little bit tedious and annoying. It's much easier to be able to draw these kinds of things. But what we see here is I have a story graph for, I call it Act 1. And I have all these states that the story can get into and paths in between those states. And then you can see all these zeros here, but then there's the first one has the story fragment intro attached to it. And so when I first play, that's the story this is rendering that story fragment called QUS intro. And then the rest of these, since they have no content, they are falling back to the developer mode display. Now, that's an okay start, but it turns out I don't quite like the way that I have built this. Because some of the time what happens is I structure this high level thing. And some of these nodes, for instance, like the woods and going to the dungeon alone and so on, uh, these are things that uh, I want to have some gameplay take over. Like I don't want to still be in a story graph. I want the game like a systematic game loop to take control of the game at those points. But at some of the other nodes on the same top level graph, I still want story graphs to take over. So like the in town part will influence the systematic gameplay, but it will be itself orchestrated most easily if I use another story graph inside that node. Essentially, right? So when you enter into town, I then have like a small graph that's contained within that node that shows or that directs how you can explore the beginning of the game with the intro to like being in town. And I don't want to have to build out the whole complex nest of the graph right here inside the story graph, because then I have over here this really high level concept of being in the dungeon alone or being in the dungeon with the guides, right? Or being in the woods. And if you're in any of these states, the gameplay stuff is happening. So I can't break that down into story graph stuff because that's not going to be a story graph. That's going to be a different kind of game loop. But here, this is like at the same level of abstraction when I'm sort of plotting out the outline of the interactive story. This is at the same level of the outline as these things, but its contents want to be another story graph like within it. So I I don't want to just splat those lower level story graphs right inside of and hook them up to the big one, like the top level one, because then I'm mixing my levels of abstraction in that top level graph. And it kind of makes organizing harder, it become even more states and stuff. So so I want to work on today in the story engine being able to, when you enter into a node, have that node instead of it becoming its own like directly rendered piece of text like we have in the first one, or game loop like we're going to someday have in these ones. I also want this ability to say, hey, let another story graph take over, and when that story graph reaches a terminal node, let it pop back to the story graph before. And I already have this idea of the story machine started, right? So I have now this story machine, and you can see right here at the beginning of the game, when we first initialize a run, we are taking the story machine from the application state, and we are pushing the root story node onto it, right? But there's some other features that are missing. Right now, this is kind of just a data structure. It does not have the automatic like machinery for, if I select a node, figuring out like, oh, this node doesn't display content. It just automatically churns through a couple of instructions and either pushes the stack or pops the stack or whatever. So that's what we're going to work on. Hi, Gobsmack Goose, welcome. Yeah, I'm basically starting up a modern text adventure project. Would something like Metadesk format assist with graph representation? Gobsmack Goose asks. It could. So let me think about that for a minute. Down here, I'm representing a graph as these states, and I think ultimately, doing anything in text to represent a graph is kind of hard. Like, let's play with that question for a minute, right? So if I wanted to, I could start doing something like, okay, intro is a state, and in town is a state. So on the left here, I'm showing what this might look like if I started spinning something up in Metadesk. I could also do something like this. I could go state, right? Like here's my states and tag them to make states, right? So here are a couple options I could have. Well, let's say I went with the first one because that kind of makes it look like a variable declaration. Then I could do like a path. How would I do a path? I could do a path like this maybe. I could do path intro in town, right? And then choose character, right? But I don't think that this ultimately would be much different than using macros. Like ultimately the hard parts here are I can't visually see the connection here. And if I try to put that there, I start to run into problems like, well, okay, but in town can transition to two different things. And how am I gonna, like, the layout in text is always kind of a problem. If you really wanted something to look right, like you'd have like, okay, intro can go to in town, right? You'd start doing this, and this wouldn't be Metadesk anymore, right? But you could start to imagine like maybe you can do like an ASCII art system for fun to represent a graph. Like what if you could do a graph like this? And so here's camp is one of the states you can get to, and let's draw that like that. And maybe the other state you can get to is what's it? Woods 1, right? So this, I think, starts to be more useful because now I can see the flow, which it puts the paths like in a visual relationship with their states. You could also imagine like, hey, I don't want the paths to be able to cross like that, in which case you could do something like this, right? But this is still missing a bunch of stuff. I can't very easily attach things to the paths, and like if I need more space, the layout's all wrong. So I think a visual editor for the graph, the directed graphs is honestly the only good solution for building them. Brett, I'm planning to stream from now until maybe about noon or 1 Pacific time, so that's about 3 to 3.5 or 4 hours, probably. So I don't know. I think representing graphs in text is hard, especially representing graphs in text manually. Like if you were serializing out to text, that's one thing. But editing a graph and maintaining it in text is just nasty, especially when you want to also be attaching data to the states and to the paths and stuff. Not ideal. So anyway, I want to be able to say when you go to in town, right? So let me show you the other thing. I started trying to implement arrive in town a different way. So I have these files over here. Looks like I've dumped all of their content at this point, so they're not useful to look at actually. But I want it when I go into town that the story machine over here, right? We've got this story machine. it's got a stack ready to go, and each level on the stack is its own story graph. And so I want to be able to say if you've made a move on the graph, there should be a concept in the engine of when you select a node, or when the machine has like an update. Okay, let's think about it this way. The machine has a sort of update rule. And when the machine is on a node with content, the update is sort of terminated. The update stops. The update is something that when it's on content needs to wait for a user to make an interaction to figure out where to go next. So when we get to a point where we know what content to display, we can't keep updating because the content needs to go to the user. And at the very least, they need to turn the page. Maybe they need to make a decision. But if there's no content to show, then something else needs to happen. And I still want to have this dev fallback idea, but in this case, I want to be able to say, hey, if you can see that I don't have any content, but what I do have is an instruction to push another graph and start walking it to find content, right? And that's what I want to build today is the update logic that takes over and the way to encode an instruction here on the in town node that tells it to transition, to like call into another story graph essentially. So I actually already have one piece of the system that does something like this, where there's sort of an update type rule hidden inside the game logic, and I need to find that and reorganize it because it's hidden in the yeah. So we have these story graph select. Yeah, you can see I've already got notes in here that's like, this is all probably bad. So story graph select, what is this one? This takes in a node. It does the cleanup for the previous node. So it gives the director a chance. I'm skipping over what a director is, but that's basically how we attach content to a node. So it cleans up a director from the node we were on. And then it sets this node to the top of the graph, and then it initializes the new director. So this is 100% stuff we could put into the story machine, right? Yeah, this is kind of like helper level stuff. This is saying once we know what node to be going to, here's how to do it. And I'm going to just bury that down here as a helper for now. It might end up being something we don't even want a code path for, or like a function for. I imagine this will just be a part of a slightly more sophisticated code path, and so it won't even need to have like a named entry point that could be confused for reusable. But it's definitely not safe to pass any old node into this function right now, because if you pass a node that doesn't have content, it's gonna it's not gonna crash, but it's gonna get into a wrong state. We want to say if it doesn't have content, you shouldn't even end up here. So we want to start trying to not treat that as just a safe entry point to use for selecting the node anywhere. You know what, I don't want to write this here yet because I'm pretty convinced we're also going to end up chopping this up into blocks. So I'm just going to say, let's take that out and we'll deal with what breaks. Now, what about graph move? What is that doing? Graph move is taking in, so this is a game level concept, not a part of the story machine concept. And it's just an enum with integers. But that move then goes and gets passed to the story graph to an update function, which is taking in the node pointer. And that's not going to be good enough because this is the kind of thing which now might want to go all the way through and like modify it and push and pop the stack. So what I think maybe my approach will be to start gutting the helpers that I have so far and breaking stuff until I find a good place where I can start reintegrating the new ideas. Yeah, so this is a payload processing function. That means it's a payload A payload is something you can attach. So here's where I do the writing for the game, and then I want to be able to create these interactable pieces of text and attach behavior to them. And I attach behavior to them by attaching a payload, and then calling a payload processing function sort of through this thing, which says that if this gets interacted with, if this gets clicked, then this handler will take over and do the processing of that interaction. And this one is just saying the rule is to take the move parameter and take the move parameter, which is not here, but take a move parameter off the block and then update the machine. So I think this could work. If we had something like a, let's grab the story machine. Right, we could imagine like a story machine move, right? And I just say, here's the machine, here's the move, that's what should happen. So I think that might be a good point where to start actually implementing this idea of an update, or maybe it'll be called a move. Because now the story machine, and this will be called a path code. So it's called a move from the perspective of the game, but at the level of the story graph, which is not, which is supposed to be a little bit more generic than the game layer, I just call it a path code. So it's just a 32-bit integer that uniquely identifies a path in the story graph. And so if the player makes a move, they can, the story fragment that they're interacting with can use a game move as long as it's unique. It's up to the story fragments themselves to organize the codes to be unique at that point. But they can pass the move that they want, and that just acts as the path code for the game, or for the machine, right? So we could implement that, and that would give us this ability to do a story graph move that goes through the whole story machine. The story path continue. I think I would prefer that to go through the move story graph thing again. Actually, why don't we rename this now to move story graph could be move story machine. And if you are on a path, you'll pass the same kind of stuff. We wouldn't need this. This would just, there'd be one entry point for saying, hey, take the current state of the machine and update it. So an idea that happens in the story graphs already is that you have a node pointer, and that can be on one of the states. It can also be on one of the paths between states. And the reason I want to be able to have it on either is so that I can sort of flexibly say, like, hey, I've already got these two states with game logic, and I want some transition text that only happens at the beginning of the new state on this particular path, and only happens at the end of the, right? If I have, let me draw this for you again. We'll do a little ASCII art. So I have A here, right? And there might be two different ways to exit from A. So we have this way and that way. And so they might look like this. Whoops. There we go. Right, if it's like this and this. So if this is story graph point A, and then over here we have story point C, and up here we have story point B, but then there might be another way to enter into C. So imagine there's also a entry point right here, right? That might look like it's coming from somewhere else. We don't necessarily care where, but it's coming from over here or something. Maybe it's a little tough to make that look right. Well, you get the idea. So if we have this path coming into C and this path coming into C and two paths coming out of A, right? The ability to just attach something onto the path is pretty useful here, because I might say, like, okay, in the unique case that I'm entering C from this path and leaving A from this path, I want to have some flavor text that would never show up if it's not attached to the end of the A state. It's not attached to the beginning of the C state generally. It's just this path. if you've taken this direction, so you can imagine a scenario where you, if this is a location, this is the story that occurs if you get into a certain location, and this is one of the ways to get into that location, then this should be like the description of taking that route, and this is this could be a description of getting there by another route, right? You fall into the room or you enter through a door, but here you leave from so you shouldn't show the text of entering to the door. So the intro text wants to be different depending on the path. Now, you could always just insert another node in the middle, right, to make this work. But that was sort of like, I don't know, a bit of strictness that's kind of annoying. Like, it would feel like I had to, I like the feeling of systems that have this sort of like slight flexibility so that I can sort of gracefully modify my data structure in steps. I don't want to have a super rigid data structure that can only be used one way. I want to have it be something that I can work with and evolve it over time. So if I've already built the graph and decided, okay, I'm ready to attach some content, and what I'd really like is some intermediate between A and C that is unique to that path. Yes, ultimately it might turn out that I want a whole node there and fill in that a little more. But before I get there, I might just say, you know what, just attaching it on the path is good enough, and let's let that make sense too. So, point of all that is, whether the node is on a state node or a path node, I want this single update logic to still make sense. Now this was the canary in the coal mine that something was wrong, so I'm just going to take that out now. I know I don't want that there, and if everything here works the way I expect it to. And this is the one I'm actually calling, and it's basically taking the parameter to set the current player and then doing the choose character move. So I can just copy this block here and say, instead of grabbing the move from the parameter block, in this case, the move is fixed, so it goes like that. Apologies, I thought I had muted before I started trying to deal with my congestion. I'm going to do my best to not make gross sounds, but I'm a little congested, so I have to occasionally clear out, Anyway, let's clean up from this now. Director handle. Okay, so this is where before I had been using director handle because I was passing the logic on to the director to be handled, and I don't like that. I want to be able to say the whole story machine can handle this. So move story machine should do the trick. Move story graph. Now, who is this? Okay, so you're just this is the dev node, like developer version. So it's printing out text the same way that you would for a story fragment, except that this is the developer version. So it uses the same API to build the string though. Gobsmack Goose asks, is that a similar concept to immediate mode GUI state updates to add state on a story path, so to speak? I don't think that they're the same idea. I'm not quite following what connection you're trying to make there. So it might be that there's a connection that you're seeing that I'm not. But I'm not. I don't follow right now, so I can't say yes. So let's see. Right, so we got to go implement the new function that I proposed over here in the story machine. Okay. So the story machine, whoops, and I'll turn around. Here we go. The story machine. We want to be able to, okay, so first of all, we can only proceed if the machine actually has something at the top of its stack. And then if it does, we grab that stack node, and we're going to look at its pointer. Call that top. That way I can use a story node to grab the top. Node is the top putter. Okay, so there's the node. We'll call that current node. And our goal now is to figure out how to select another node. So QU story node get current node. And this is going to be where we actually implement the entire update logic now. So it's actually going to be a major function, not a minor one. So this is going to be the next node. And that starts at current node. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, first of all, let's look at what kind of node this is. Right, so the nodes come in two kinds, state and path. Maybe that'll change in the future. Maybe there'll be more types. I don't expect that, but that could be cool. I don't know. If we're on a state node, okay, if we're on a path node, we actually ignore the path code, and the next node becomes the current node's destination. So a story node has features for path type nodes or kind nodes and features for state kind nodes. So path kinds have a destination, and that's just the end point of the path, right? The path is like a pair of states that is directed, and so the next node should be the destination of the path, and the path code is relevant. But in the case of a state, it gets a little bit more involved because we have a list of path nodes to look at. So let's see, QU story node, current node, first out path. We have a list of nodes, and we're looking to see if any of these nodes have a path code equal to the path code we're trying to match. And if they do, that becomes our next node. Right, and then we can break. Okay. So one way or the other, we should have a next node. Now, if that next node is the current node, it's because we're on a state and we got a path that didn't match any of the existing. We got a path code that didn't match any of the existing paths on the state node here. So it doesn't know where to go, and it'll see that the one it's on, it has content and stop right away. But next, what we want to do is we have a node, but we don't know if we want to stop there, right? So here we've got a path node. Here we've got a state node. So next what we want to do is the sort of automatic run logic that can do things like if it's on a path with no content, skip it. If it's on a state with content or a path with content, stop. If it's on a path with no content, but it has some instructions, run those instructions to update the node pointer instead, right? And then keep going. So that's what's going to go here. Is this will be like the state update like loop or something like that. And what that's going to do is at each step, it's going to look at our node kind, and first it's going to figure out, is this a stop point? So it's a stop point if it's For now, the only rule is this: if next node kind is path. This is the only rule we have so far, so I'm going to write this, and then we'll add in new rules and update the implementation of the rule loop as we go. So if it's a path node and its director is null, so this means it has no content attached, then the next node should be the next node's destination, right? So we step again. I'm going to actually make a new node pointer here, call it the iterator or something like that, and that way I can just call next node it, right? So if it kind is path and it has no director, then it goes to it destination. And then otherwise it can stop. So if it finds a state node, it can stop. If it finds something with a director, it can stop. Right? Okay, so that's our only rule right now. But with that rule, I think we'll get everything. Let me go back and double check that I didn't kind path, right? Is that implemented or mentioned anywhere here? Kind state. What about in story graph? I might be redundantly doing this idea. Machine move, kind path. I don't see it, so I don't think I have anywhere where I'm duplicating this idea of skipping empty paths. So if we go, okay, nothing is happening now. Oh, right. So finally, when it's done, we want to update the machine's state pointer. This might not quite work in the long run. We have to watch out for this. I think this might be a busted idea. But I'm thinking like we take the top of the stack and we set it equal to it, right? But that's where I had over here in the game logic before, this extra bit of an idea that I actually need to keep. So I need to be able to keep the idea that if I'm leaving a node, that I can clean it up first. So if we come in here, and we find that if the iterator we're landing on is not the prev node, then we're going to do the following things. We're going to clean up the prev node. I think the prev node is guaranteed to exist in this version. And set the pointer and then initialize the new one. So clean up the previous one, set the top of our stack, initialize the new one. This is all only half right. As soon as I start pushing and popping the stack, this won't be good anymore, and we won't. So that means this won't be good anymore. The way we initialize and clean, like choose which one to clean up, we might need to run the cleanup sooner if we're popping things, and I want to be able to free them. So this is going to get more interesting and delicate, but I think this works. Except I need to remember the prev node at the beginning. Yeah, why don't we save that right here? There we go. Perfect. Okay, so that's all still working as it was before. Except now, it's running all of the logic for updating the graph state is running through the full story machine instead of through a single like graph walk logic, which sets us up a little better. So I can clear out all the stuff that I was planning to clear out there. I think that was all of it. Okay. Okay. So that's a good start. Now we have two different places where we need to chip away, two different places to chip away at simultaneously in order to make more progress. One piece of the problem is that right here, I need a way to attach the instruction, right? Just because I don't have content on in town doesn't mean it knows how to automatically do the right thing. And if I want it to do something that is only happening on this node, it still has to be uniquely specified on this node somehow. So it's going to end up going here, either as a new parameter or as this parameter. Let me think through what it would mean if it was a new parameter first, because that's easier, although probably worse. So that would mean all of these have to get a new parameter, right? And the paths would all have a new parameter too. And there would be a content and an instruction slot on every node. But you could only ever use one of them, I think. I don't think it would be very useful. Like if I have my instructions generally are instructions of how to get off of the node immediately. So if I have an instruction that's like, when you arrive at this node, immediately push a new graph and start walking the initial node of that graph, then what's the point of having content on this node, right? Well, how would you first display the content? And what if and the content isn't a simple thing. What if the content is a complicated sub game of its own, right? Its own game loop. Like I plan on attaching down here. If I have attached an entire game loop there, it just doesn't make any sense. I don't like the feeling of that. So maybe it makes sense if this is a type of director. Okay? So a director is the thing I'm attaching right now to specify how to show content from that node. And the plan is that directors will contain things like the instructions on how to run other game loops, like random encounters and strategic combat loops and stuff like that. They might all go through these directors instead of through story graphs. And right now I have one special case of that is I can pass in just some story fragment with some fixed options and have those fixed options be programmed right inside the story fragment. And by programmed, I mean, they have the payloads attached. But now it sort of sounds like I might want to be able to do something like define GR for graph push for pushing onto the stack, and then specify an entire story graph right here so that I can go GR push, and then there's the arrive in town, or we call it like in town 1 story, right? So grab me the story state, or the story graph. So here we're building a story graph called story. Maybe we've already built an in town 1 story, and I want to be able to push that. I want to be able to push that as an instruction from here. And then this would be like QU director graph push S, right? Oh, and then this would need the arena so that it can allocate the I always say directory too. Foxic, welcome. Are you a Forcoder fan? It sounds like from your comment that you're a Forcoder fan. All right, we want to get rid of the generic director, and we want to get rid of the GR push down here at the bottom. So I think that sort of thing might be a good idea. Gotcha. Director graph pop. So here we want like a return code kind of thing. Focus. Is Focus a text editor? Let's take a look. I see it's a text editor, although I can't find any cool screenshots that are not tiny. Let me see. Looks pretty minimal, which I approve of. Okay, so I think this is the right idea. So we will make a kind of director which represents instructions for the node that modify the story machine and continue the update loop. Basically, they are instructions to the mini VM that we're going to start building right here. Right, we're building a VM, not a Turing complete bytecode interpreter for a like pretending to be a CPU kind of VM, but some kind of virtual machine that has some interesting properties of like these walking graphs on stacks and instructions for manipulating the state of that machine. And so these are like, this is like an instruction that says stop here and use this information as content. This is like an instruction that says modify the graph machine with a push, right? Push a graph. And so that's a gr push instruction. And the gr pop instruction is like a return. So this is like an integer code that you return to get handled by the node below you somehow. Yeah, let's try that. Let's try that. So there's going to be a few things we have to do to actually get this up and running. Let's start by implementing these two functions. Actually, yeah, this is going to be involved. So I'm going to need to just start digging in. So right now, I have these directors, and they're kind of these like, I don't know what you call them, sort of like C closures, these unhappy closure type things. Maybe a little bit object-oriented. They got a function pointer and a data pointer kind of thing. It's kind of feeling like maybe we're going to have a little bit more fixed structure here than I initially realized. So we're still going to have a procedure, and we might still need these commands that can go into those procedures and the data that can go with the director. But I think we're going to end up having now a director kind. Right? So when we have a director, we can have a... I keep saying directory. It's so hard to type the word director for some reason without turning it into directory. So director kind is... It can be a stop, which is like, stop and show content. It can be a graph push. It can be a graph pop, right? Okay, so this reveals me that, okay, this is a st proc. The QU director constructor, yeah, lots of stuff we gotta do. Lots of stuff to do. I think that's the only change I need to make to the data structure. Now the constructors are going to be, I did it again, directory. The constructors are going to be very different looking now. So let's do, yeah, these are director calls. So this is how you can call the director procedure. And it like, these just nicely handle the passing the command and formatting the parameters for you. These are the director constructors. And we're going to have so this first one here is a director stop, right? And that requires a proc, a data pointer, and a size, and then it allocates all that onto an arena, sticks it in a director, and returns that to you. We're going to want a director, QU director graph push. Just going to take an arena and a QU story graph. I guess I just call that a story, huh? Do I like that? I might be up for renaming that to story graph. I think I'd be a little happier that way. Story graph. Yeah, so these are just big functions. Let's not try to stick it on a single line. Big function lines are okay. Story begin, story graph, story graph, story graph. I'm probably at the point just about where I could stand to make this layer not a QU layer and make it a story layer of its own. Feeling like we're about there. Then we would be able to shorten these names down again, and we would have separated out the story machine and the story graph types from the sort of game layer completely. They're already in a separate like layer as a file, but there's namespace together still. So the separation might be just about ready now to go the next step and give them their own namespace. Okay. Right, so let's go and implement the new upgraded organization here. So drop in those comments. This is a director stop. And when we build it, we now need to tell it what kind of director it is. Director kind stop. We also want a pop here, and we can drop a code there. So this will be a director kind graph push. Doesn't need a proc, but for its data, it needs to point at the story graph. And this is going to need a pop type kind here, and for its data, it's going to need, from int code. There we go. So we stick the code that we want to pop back into the director there. Now, here, what we want to do is we want to say if we have a director that is a stop, like a stop kind. Right? So these aren't just saying you need to have a director anymore. they're saying you can only do these calls on directors that have the stop kind, right? Because, and the reason for that is the stop kind is the one that actually has this procedure that you can stop on an initialized state and render to the player. I don't know if we're going to want to keep this payload idea or if that is a part of a scar from the bad previous iteration I was on that we'll want to heal away at some point. I'm not sure. It has a little bit of an ick factor for me, but at the same time I might need something like this. I could end up with something simpler. It's also possible that I don't end up liking this command thing and I switch to a full-on vtable with multiple function pointers. It's sort of starting to feel like that might be perfectly appropriate. We'll see. Okay, so now the only thing that doesn't exist here is the in town 1 story. So let's go and write that story. Right, we'll do this, we'll do this. And I'm starting to have more than one place where I define all this graph constructor stuff. Also, this is wrong now. This is a stop, right? So this is a stop, and this is like a stop string, I think would be good names for these. So this is a stop string. Stop string, graph pop, okay. Right, so I have all these helpers, and I'm gonna end up having them used in 2 of these functions now. I might end up wanting to just put all of my story building functions in like their own sort of unique file, sort of like what I've done over here with the story fragments. Just make their own like isolated location where I've sort of got these content definition functions where I'm basically using the C code as a hacked version of a content editor. But what I can do to get us going here is I can go QU story graph. In town 1 story can just be constructed right in place for now. Right? And if I want to get a little better here, if I want the system to work a little better, what I might need to do is I might need to figure out how I'm going to like declare all the stories as these separate files, right? Kind of like with the intro thing. Have all of the graphs get started, like have the story begin for all the graphs, and then go through this, because what I'm going to run into is eventually I don't want to have to manually do the dependency here, right? Right now I'm manually doing this. Act 1 has a link, right? This is like linking to in town 1. And then I have to manually make sure that in town 1 exists inside the scope of this. And so this is no longer just defining the story graph for Act 1. It's also declaring this dependency sort of up top here. And I don't want that to be a part of the way you have to do things. I'd rather it be like the content resolution system just does this linking and goes, hey, I see you have a piece of story that matches, that's labeled the same as the thing you're looking for here. They link up automatically and no order dependency matters. You don't have to sort that out yourself anymore, something like that. All right. So anyway, for now, let's build a story here that will represent what happens in town. Now, I don't want to take the time. I don't, I like the way I built this one is I actually like did a little thinking, got some inspiration, and then sketched it all out on my whiteboard. And that's not really what I want to do today. It might be someday fun to, like, if I've got a good story engine going and I'm not mostly thinking about the programming and I'm building the game, it might be fun to have like a writing stream where I try to do some of the content of an actual game on stream. But that's not what we're going to do today. We are going to do we're going to do just like completely developer style. Like, this is the same thing as if you were doing programmer art. This is programmer art where the story that I wrote is programmer story. So we go into town, so we're going to have an arrive node. There's a special rule, which is whichever state you initialize first has the special privilege of being the initial state. So when you begin a story graph, like when I push the story graph at the beginning of the game, it just knows intro is where we begin. So now it's going to just know if everything I've built is working the way I imagine it's working right now. If it's working correctly, it's going to just know that arrive is the state to start at. And then we're going to say, so if we look into my larger graph here, once you're in town, you have two different paths you can take. You can either hire some guides and go to their camp, or you can search for the dungeon yourself and go into the woods on your own. Okay? So those are the two paths outside of in the larger graph. Those are the two paths out of this node. And so the subgraph is going to have to end up showing the same characteristics, right? It needs to also have two final states. So whatever happens internally, it can be as complex or as simple as it wants to be, but it must ultimately arrive at making a decision in the original graph to either hire or search, right? Those are the only two outcomes that are relevant to the graph that contains it. And all the other things that you do there can still matter to the game, by the way. They just matter to the game by affecting game state that it lives outside of the story graph system completely. You can think of the story graph as sort of like a giant control flow system that the player navigates through a narrative. The narrative becomes the web of possible control flow states that contains the game, that structures the game. But all the game can still have shops and stuff where you spend the amount of money you spend is tracked, and the items that are still at the shop are tracked and stuff like that if you want, right? That doesn't have to be inside the story graph. So let's see here. You come into town and you need to either hire or go to camp. So we'll have two states here, which will represent two different ways to get there, right? Let's call it like tavern and library. And we'll have a path from arrive to tavern that we'll just reuse. I think I might actually have some, let's call this tavern and library. So tavern and library. And then we'll have another set of states here, which will be go to hire and go to search, right? And there will be a path from tavern to go to hire, and a path from library to go to search. And these will just be the continue. So continue means that it's like a turn of the page. There's no choice. It's just you got a message and you can continue from there. Right, so there's a path connecting from there to there, from there to there, there to there. Good. And then we want to do graph pop on each of these. Right, so this is where it gets fun. This should be a graph pop of QU game move higher and a graph pop of QU game move search. So if this works, what I want to have happen once I've built the whole system is you come into town, right? And you are given the choice to go to tavern or library. And then tavern takes you to a path which when you continue, right, it's just like, oh, you went to the tavern, whatever. We are not actually implementing any of the content that makes this pretty or like well written. It's just the structure. So, oh, you're in tavern, and if you continue, you go to this state. You never see this state because this state has an instruction director which says, do a graph pop and carry the code higher. And since we pop back to here, we then see, oh, well, this node here has two paths, higher and search, so they must be selecting this path. And if you were, on the other hand, to come here and make the decision library, then you would gather information to go searching by yourself. And so you, when you continue, are popped to the search path, right? So we use this graph, which is going to get pushed onto the stack. We should see content from the developer display systems coming out of this graph. So things like arrive, tavern, library, and then continue. And when we hit the continue button, we'll pop ourselves off that stack. We'll pop one off the stack, and we'll be back into this graph, right? That is the flow that should happen if it's all working. Now, we haven't implemented everything yet, and that includes we haven't implemented. Right, I should rewrite this a little bit. You could visit the library. I forgot I had already written this part, which I don't think we're actually using right now. Gather information about the region, whatever. But I'm just going to fill that in since it was written. I might want it the way it was before. I don't know. It doesn't matter. That's not really what I'm trying to do right now. So everything's building, but I don't expect it to work because we've done only most of what we needed to do. We implemented, let's go through it so far, right? What have I done so far? I modified the director type to have this kind. I set up the new director constructors. I gave myself the new macros for using the updated director constructors. By the way, this director constructor here this one is implemented by the game layer, and it's a little bit busted. I guess we could do director kind stop, right? But what I really want to do is say to do how to do this without having to reach into the director manually. Right, I should be able to build that on the existing API, but I can't because it's using data without actually thinking of it as a data block, and the stop only works on that principle right now. So I kind of need two different ways to construct stops. Don't know yet. Anyway. Gobsmack asks, when would it be important to have story graph structure be fixed versus it being dynamic? Or is the answer it depends, having the option to decide whenever, and it's not either or? So it's an interesting question. I don't exactly know what you mean by fixed or dynamic, but like fixed is pretty clear. Well, but the question is dynamic how, right? So if you want it to be dynamic in what way? Because there's a couple ways it can be dynamic. So if you're building an editor for a story graph, it definitely can't be fixed because you're changing it all the time. So there you would need a data structure a little more sophisticated than the one I have, because the one I have works, but it does not make it very easy to modify in place. the data structure I have is also missing things like it doesn't give spatial locations to anything in the graph. So at runtime, the spatial layout of the graph would be irrelevant, but in a graph editor, you might want to assign spatial locations to parts of the graph just so that you can control the layout and organize it in the ways you see fit. So that might be some of the sorts of things that are different between an editor and a runtime. Another thing is if you were using this, if you were using this in a different way, like if you were using this as the core computing paradigm that you were going to run with, which I'm not sure that I think that's a good idea, but it's kind of interesting, right? Like you could imagine a world where you have these function blobs that are connected to each other in a graph, and that your program is a flow through this graph. So it's kind of weird. Like I think, I've had conversations with people who work on visual programming stuff, and I'm not sure how I feel about control flow graph being the graph you implement or like directly edit. The Unreal Blueprint stuff has a mixture of control flow and data flow, and a lot of other projects play with doing just data flow. And I think that is interesting in some ways, but doing just a control flow and then having regular old code in the nodes is also kind of interesting. It's true to lower level details of how a compiler thinks about your code. So it is interesting to look at it that way, as like, here's a block of code, and at the end it leaps to one of the other blocks. And so then loops become actual like cycle arrows in your graph, right? And stuff like that, which is cool. But I don't know if I think that that's a good way to program. So I don't know. If you were going to do that, though, if you were going to build lots and lots and lots of detail into the graph, tons, so that there was lots of processing that had to happen, right? Like right now, most nodes in my graph are content nodes, or it takes 1 or 2 or 3 skips to go from the node you started on to a content node. So the logic only has to apply a couple of times. But if you were going to implement like your entire program, and you were going to say like, you know what, drop the concept of content in most places and do lots and lots of logic within the graph structure, you might start wanting to think about how to optimize the machine, and then not modifying the graph on the fly would be important, because you could then bake down things like, what are the list of paths, what are the transforms. You could do like, oh, if you're on this path, pre-resolve the compute to where this path goes as far as possible. All kinds of stuff like that you could do. So then you would want it to be fixed. But I don't know. Maybe I'm not understanding your question the way you thought of it. If you're asking like, why am I building it at runtime? So this might be what you're asking. When I think about it, maybe this is a little bit more like what you had in mind. Right now I'm building the story graph by like calling a function that builds it at runtime. Like I run my program, and at the beginning of my program, the story graph doesn't exist, and I have this function I call that actually constructs the story graph at runtime. And you might be asking, when would it be important to stop doing this and have it be fixed? Like have it be known at compile time what the data of the story graph is. And that's a good question. I don't get too worried. I actually think of this as fixed right now. So if you're thinking of this as dynamic right now, I would disagree. It's fixed. It would be dynamic if it was mutating at runtime, but all I'm doing is this is a data structure that is not very easy to construct in C literals. Like it's not very easy to sit here and write story graph story equals here's my graph, right? There's no very good way to do that. It would be even more stilted than these macros if I tried to do it this way. So I kind of think of this as just fixed content right now. And if you're thinking of this as dynamic, then it's only dynamic in the sense that I'm using the C runtime to construct my data literals. But where would you want it to be dynamic besides the editor is a really interesting question. Something I would love to get to is if I got to the point where I felt pretty comfortable with the core runtime of a story engine, and I was feeling good about how to build a game with it that was using a fixed graph. Generative stuff here, like I did the Roguelike Jam, right? And in the Roguelike Jam, I had a fixed story graph. I didn't even have a story graph, actually. Like all my story stuff was completely implicit. I had no explicit story graphs in the game jam. it was all built out of like story fragments and interactions and the logic and stuff, and it's hard to maintain. I think that going in this direction is going to make it easier to organize big rich concepts and then still build a game into it. We'll see. That's where I'm. This is like the experiment, but it's a little bit more of a longer experiment because I have to build these data structures and mechanisms for running with it. But what I would really love, and if I had more of this built ahead of time, what I really actually envision is having a certain amount of proceduralness in here. So you don't want it to be like completely procedural every time, because even if you could figure out how to generate new story from scratch without an AI or something, your player would just never get to learn like how to navigate through the system. So like if you think about roguelikes, they're procedural, but they also have a certain fixed meta structure that you can learn. And I think you wouldn't want to abandon that, but it might be cool to be able to have it be so like, so you might get to a point where you're making things so dynamic that like that it feels like the story graph is procedural. However, I think that in that case you would still have like, so say you, for instance, you have a town and you're going to put four side characters for the main player, for the player to interact with, but you're going to pick those four characters from a bank of 12 possible character archetypes. So some stories will be just completely different than others because of which characters are there at the beginning of the story. And so the story graphs wouldn't necessarily be generated themselves, but the engine might be kind of doing something like, how Spelunky, I don't know if you've looked at how Spelunky is implemented, but Spelunky has procedural levels, but it's made out of these like larger tiles that are handcrafted, and then they have like rules about how they fit together. And I think what you would do to make a procedural story game is something similar. You would describe story graphs of medium to small size, right? The sort of subgraphs, not the huge metagraph. You'd also have one of those, and that would be fixed. But then you'd have these subgraphs of like, this character's relationship with you has a graph of how it evolves, and each of the characters has one. And then when you pick some characters, what you're doing is you're picking which snippets to stitch together out of your pre-built story graphs. But the stitching together is not itself a new story graph. It's a program that's sort of choosing how to dynamically drop you into different pre-built story graphs, right? So you would then get that learnability. My vision is if you could do something like that, I think you could get the learnability that you get out of a roguelike, of like after repetition, you start to see the patterns, you start to see the meta structure, you start to see how to navigate the challenges, but they still get put together in new ways every time you play. And I think that could happen with narrative structures like story graphs, if these things got sophisticated enough. So that's a long answer to your question, but it sounds like we hit the nail somewhere along the way of what you were looking for. So cool. Right, so I've got everything now, except I don't think the story machine is going to be able to handle these new instructions, right? We haven't done that. So how does this work? We come in, if our stack is not empty, then we look at what the next node should be, and then we run the state update loop right here. And that starts by taking the iterator node and looking at its kind and saying, okay, if that's a path and our director is null, then move on. Yeah, we start wanting to do something a little more interesting here. So whatever kind of state we get, I think the first thing we want to do, or whatever kind of node we get, I think the first thing we want to do is say, check what kind of director we have, because what kind of director we have tells us a lot more now. So if we don't have a director that is interesting, why don't we do that? Okay. So let's figure out what kind of director we have. And null will represent that we actually have no director. So if it director does not equal 0, then the director kind comes from the director, right? So here we know if it's null, that means we had no director. And if it's not null, then it's one of these things, and we know what kind of director we have. So now we have the 4 cases flattened out onto this integer. And we want to handle them, but we also kind of want to know what kind of node we have. So let's grab that information from there, right? And right, okay. So if we see, let's just do a switch on the director kind here. And this is where it's starting to look more like a VM, right? This is kind of what I was expecting. We were going to end up with these operations that are different operations we want to handle inside of a loop as we are discovering them. What's different here is we don't have a stream of instructions to decode. Rather, we have a graph. And as we walk along the vertices and edges of the graph, they are providing the operation codes that we're processing. And yeah, in all likelihood, this can be compiled down to just a simple straight bytecode because that's how compilation works. It's possible, so this could be optimized as hard as you want, but right now I don't think that's actually the big concern. It's more about the flexibility and expressiveness of this structure. Okay, so if we get a stop, let's see here. What do we want to do? So I think I'll pull that out up here so we can go, if the director kind is stop, then that means we just stop. It doesn't matter if we're on a path or a state, we stop. If the director kind is null, I don't like that. Okay, I'm gonna do it this way then. We're gonna do stop equals 0. So if we get a stop, we just set stop to 1. If we get a null, we look at the node kind then, right? If the node kind is path, then we iterate to the end of the path, right? And otherwise, why don't we just turn this into a switch? I don't know for sure that there's ever going to be another kind of node, but I'm going to just build it like there might be, because I don't know why. I'm just getting a feeling that I like switches right now, I guess. Here we do a stop. So even if this is does not have a director, we always stop on a state because a state can have multiple paths going forward. And we don't have any way to guess. And also we want to, we have that fallback of showing the developer display of this particular state. So there's no danger in stopping anywhere. It's not like it's going to break things. It's just going to reveal the developer mode that's, there as a fallback. And so this should never actually get hit in a working, like a final game, because that would be a bug, or rather it would be like incomplete. It would mean your game is incomplete because you stopped on a state where there was no content and just showed off the developer fallback version. But while we're developing, we want that feature. And so I'm going to build a machine to work that way because I'm thinking not just about what the final runtime of the game would be like, but also what this machine is like to work with day to day for the developer. And that seems like the right thing to do. Now, the graph push and graph pop are a little bit more interesting, right? So here what's going to happen, if I have a graph push, my current iterator is going to change, but it's first what's going to happen is we're going to push something onto the stack. And then we're going to take the iterator and jump it into the new layer of the graph, right? And this is where things like this stops being accurate. So we actually need to break this now. Let's say we're going to have a current node here. And it's going to go like that. Actually, since top can't be reused now, we'll go like that. And Why do I use separate variable? Why don't I just keep using the name current node? It does not equal current node. Like I said, I might end up having to move the cleanup up. So it might be that the first time I change it, I want to just do the cleanup right then. I mean, even here, right, I have current node. I have current node, and then I have next node. And the rule for picking next node is unique because this is the only spot where we actually use the path code. And even this is picking a node that might be different from current node. And so this right here might be where I have to clean up current node. If this is different from current node, then maybe I just clean up right there. Because if it's the same as current node, it gets more interesting. Because if it's the same as current node, in theory, if it's the same as current node, then that means that we got a path on. We were on a state node, and the path didn't go anywhere. But that's very assumption heavy. Like, it could be that in the future, getting the same current node back isn't that surprising for some reason, right? Maybe not. It's hard to say. I don't really like the idea of relying on seeing if the node changed because I might find situations where I really want to follow, was there transition logic? So like here there's transition logic, here there's transition logic. There's no way that if either of these happen, the current node, okay, so if current node is the same, then there was not transition logic, right? So I could put in a Boolean that's like has transition, and if there say right here it says has transition, then we clean up that node right there. But if we don't, the hard part is we might still end up having a transition in here later, right? So if the machine does something like, oh, yeah, I'm thinking this is just going to have to be something that's brittle. And what I mean by brittle is it's something that might break when I want to add a new feature in terms of like a new type of node. I don't have any vision for a new type of node right now, but it is kind of an interesting area for possibilities. And so I'd like to be prepared for it, but I don't want to spend too much time future proofing. So I think that my new logic is going to be for now. Clean up current node right here, because this is correct under the current circumstances. If the current node and next node are the same, the only explanation is that the current node was a state node, and that the path code didn't take me down a new path, and so I'm on the same node and no transition happened. And so in that case, I'd be fine with saying no update to no cleaning up the state of the director. And I'd be fine with saying that any other time you definitely do clean up, and you do the cleanup here, right? It can't be the case that you're on a state node that you did not find an existing path, but then this loop was going to do something for you later to change your state, right? So if current node does not equal next node, then we clean up the current node. That's just what it's going to be for now. That stops being correct the moment there is something where it's a transition in state does not show up as a change in the node pointer, or where a transition in state doesn't show up during the path code, but it does show up during the iteration loop. So if either of those two assumptions ever break because of a new feature, then this stops being good enough. But that's what I'm going to do for now. And here we say, okay, if the iterator does not equal current node. So that could be a problem. And the reason that could be a problem is it's perfectly possible that the current node, we pick a path, and that path loops back to the current node, but there was in fact a transition there, right? That the current node the path might have been a loop back, but that meant a cleanup happened here. So it's not good enough to say it does not equal current node. What we actually need to say is if this happens here, So keep track of, did we already do a cleanup? If we did a cleanup, it doesn't matter what node we land on, we have to init it. Either it's a different node or it's the same node, but either way a new initialization needs to happen. So if we did cleanup, we do the initialization, but we always want to store that. Now that's not going to be valid either because we've eliminated the top pointer from up here because of the fact that the stack can change. But we should be able to do something like this. But I think we're actually going to move this into the loop. So let me think about what that would be like. Okay, so at each step we grab the it. Oh, so close. So if we grab the iterator at the beginning and then we go, okay, what kind of thing do we have? We're going to figure out what to do, possibly changing the iterator. So we want to be careful, like when we push something onto the graph, we definitely want to update the pointer there anyway. And before we push, yes, I think what we want to do for now is say like, look, I don't know where to put it in this loop yet. But the top of the iterator pointer here is sort of our local copy of what we are thinking of as the state of the machine, right? We're thinking of the machine is on this spot. And so if we get interrupted for any reason, like we do a push, and so this layer in the stack isn't processing anymore, we still want to remember where we were at that layer in the stack, right? So while this is a local iterator, it really represents the top of the stack at each given moment. We could even go so far as to say the fully correct thing to do that doesn't have any risk of being wrong is to eliminate the it pointer completely. And anywhere where we were using it, and see, this is why we don't want to do this necessarily if we don't have to, but anywhere where we were using it, what we really meant to be doing is operating right on top of the stack, right? Like that's kind of what I'm thinking. And then if we get a stop, we can break. I think that's correct logic, but it's not necessarily what we want to write. But maybe that'll help me get this correct. Hey, welcome, K-Monk. Yeah, it's a good interview. Peter's really, really smart guy. Thanks for the compliment. All right, so let's see here. So I'm operating right on the top of the stack right now, right? The stack is this data structure, and I'm reaching into the data structure and using its field directly in order to make sure I'm constantly operating on it correctly. So there's a couple ways we could do this, right? One cute idea is to take a pointer to the pointer. So here's the cute idea. What if we did this? What if we said it is not going to be just a local pointer that is a duplicate of, that stands for what we think of as the top of the stack. But what if it actually points to the top of the stack still? So it's a pointer, and now to deal with these things, we do like star it everywhere, right? So we're still operating on the top of the stack, literally, through a double indirection. But we don't have to go through, like, you know, instead of going dereference the machine, dereference the stack, get the pointer, we do dereference the iterator once, right? It saves us one indirection total to do it this way, right? So that saves us one. It's okay. The other thing we could do is we could say, no, go back to the way it was. Don't be cute. Take the local iterator, get down to eliminate another local dereferencing, and then whenever you change the iterator value, you have to go and immediately simultaneously change the machine stack putter, right? Like that, right? So anytime we're changing it, we have to do it this way. Brett, it's on my YouTube channel. You should be able to, let me see if I can track down a link for you. View your channel. Here we go. You can watch it here, and you can also find it in my. You can also find it in, like, I've got it. You know, my podcasts are on podcast platforms, so you can look up Mr. Forth Conversations, and you'll find all the interviews on, you know, either Spotify or Pocket Cast, RSS feed type things. DesDV, hello, welcome. Yeah, the Alan Webster channel just contains the stream archives. It doesn't contain any of my edited stuff. Also, while we're talking about my YouTube channels, I now have a new one. I just started another split channel. This one is called Mr. Forth Unscripted. Let me give you the link for that. So if you go to this new one, guys, I'll show you. Right, if you come to this channel here, you'll see I'm starting a new kind of content here, which is sort of a follow-up to it's something in between the stream. The streams are, like, you know, completely just off the cuff. I just take the archive that I've recorded, stick it up on YouTube. I don't ever think about it again. With these, I am spending like an hour. You can see this is like an hour of me doing sort of like talking out loud, sort of rubber ducking into the mic about the project. And I'm doing minimal editing, so there's a little bit of visuals on it to help make it a little bit easier to follow. But I spend about 2.5 hours doing the video editing after an hour of recording. So it's very rough. It's not like my edited content over here that is for like podcasts and video essays and stuff like that. But if you want to follow my projects in more detail, like what I'm doing on the Story Engine here, there's like these design iteration streams of consciousness on this channel. So if that's up your alley, you can check that out too. K-Monk asks, what got you interested in working on the Story Engine? That's a really great question. So there's a couple of different inspirations I have. I think I've always kind of, like, I've always been a little bit of a game developer, like, enthusiast. I like novel, indie game, experimental stuff. Like, I like the wacky stuff. And so I remember when I was getting into programming, you know, when I was fairly young and was only into, like, GameMaker scripting and stuff, and I was just trying to figure out how to make my games feel better. I was always kind of interested in solving the problem of, like, if I'm gonna include a story element. So here's what happens: you can make like a good simple game, like a platformer or something, and if you start trying to include story elements, it always just feels super off. And, you know, there's been some recent titles that use traditional storytelling in games. Like, I'd say like Celeste is a good example of this, where it doesn't really change the formula of how games are telling stories, but it just does such a good job of using that formula better. But so some of this is just being a good storyteller can be hard. But there's also, like, there's a lot of ways where it feels like story in games could be more interactive and interesting. And I tried to think about that, but I didn't really, you know, I just never felt like I knew how to make progress. Then, I don't know, something like 5 or 10 years ago, Molly Rocket, you know, Casey Muratori's company, announced their 1935 game, which was supposed to be, you know, this story game that is going to completely, you know, completely change the script on what it means for a game to have interactive story. And we haven't heard about that in a while, but at the time the blog posts about that were super interesting and got me thinking about the topic a lot. Like I've had ever since then thoughts in the back of my head of like, wait, how could you do this more in a more dynamic way? How could you do that in a more interesting way? And then most recently, Storyteller. If you haven't played Storyteller, it's a game you can get on Steam, it's a really interesting like puzzle game where you sort of like lay out these like comic panels and put characters into them. So you put like a scene and you put characters into it, and you're trying to get them to interact in certain ways by laying out the story. And so it gave me another thought of like, wait, look at how the software can sort of bring to life these story elements in a logical way. There's not story is hard to, unlike like physics or um, strategy, it's harder to point to what would you do to make this interactive at first. But once you start to get a feel for it, it feels to me like there's plenty you could do to like bring to life narrative elements using interactivity. And that game really showed you a one way that you could completely rearrange your relationship between the interaction and the story in a game. And that got me completely obsessed with this idea. Des DV asks, "Is C a good language for beginners?" I wouldn't say so. I'd say C is a good language to learn for your second or third language. It's like if you if you get into programming and you've built a little bit of momentum and you feel you're good at it, I would learn C early, but not first. And I'll give you a couple of reasons why early, but why also not first. So why to do it not first is just there are better things. Like I learned on GameMaker scripts to get started. There are things where you just get more interesting feedback sooner, and that is more important when you're a beginner to be able to learn stuff than what you get in C is you have to like really muscle down and do some nasty stuff to get the first to chip away at it. Once you get some momentum with C, it's being a C programmer is kind of like, do you ever play D&D and you've heard of like the linear fighters and quadratic wizards? I think of C as the wizard, right? If you get started with C, it's going to be slow going at first, but you are going to overtake the fighters eventually. But if you start with something like GameMaker scripting or something else, like a good beginner friendly thing, it's going to let you make progress early on in a way that the wizard, you're just going to feel like you can't get it off the ground, right? You'll be able to start playing and making progress and learning. And once you feel you've made some steps and you're confident, I highly recommend you learn C, one, because it's one of the best of those like wizard type languages where you get the quadratic option. But you also want to learn C or something very similar to it because it's the best way to deepen your understanding. So if you're going from I know how to program to I really want to become a programming expert, I think C is critical, or something very C like is critical, because it's sort of like programming without any without very much distance between you and the hardware, right? It lets you really learn how computers work and gives you the options to fully take advantage of the full range. Like everything else that you've used to learn programming up until that point is built in terms of C. Like the whole computing ecosystem is built in terms of C. So if you're going to just kind of dabble, you don't need C. If you're going to get started, you don't want to start with C. But if you're going to spend time with programming, I do recommend C pretty early on. That's my recommendation. K Monk, I have seen a little bit of Chris Crawford stuff, but I have not looked into it super deeply. I have a long list of things. I've recently been on a several week retreat for myself and went through a bunch of different interactive fiction stuff. Some of it was very underwhelming. Some of it I was quite inspired by. So like just simple stuff like the fighting fantasy classics. If you haven't checked those out, are like choose your own adventure books with a little bit of an RPG game built in as well. And they're not that good, but they have a different structure than I've seen in other attempts at this kind of stuff that is a little bit reflected in what I'm doing. And um, uh, the King of Dragon Pass, I think is the name of it, was a game I played that's also kind of reflected in the structure of what I'm doing. It's sort of like you are kind of like a strategy game there where you're like managing a clan and your resources, but you also have all these events you have to deal with that are sort of like building the story of the region. And it's like half there as far as I'm concerned. It's kind of trying to blend story and gameplay. And I don't know what Chris Crawford's stuff is about too much, but I've heard that he's relevant in this field, and I need to spend more time looking at what his work is like. Unfortunately, DV, I can't give you a recommendation of what to learn first. Like I said, when I started, I learned GameMaker, and GameMaker might be a good starting point, but that was like 17 years ago, something like that. It's changed a lot since then, and I don't know what's a good starting point now. I think, if I don't know if Brett is still here, but Brett might be a better person to ask where modern beginning stuff is, because he works on making tutorials for game development and stuff a little more actively than I do. But I don't really know. I think you need to like play around until you find something that feels good and fun and that is programming, and that might not exist, which would be sad. But yeah, I just wish I don't really have good recommendations of what to learn first. Okay, I'm going to try to do a little bit more coding here. So we've got, I think all of this is about right, but we haven't implemented these two new instructions yet. So how does graph push want to work? Well, I've already got a helper here that pushes something onto the machine. So that I should be able to just use. And then I just need to figure out where I put the story. Now, I think the story is actually living on the director's data pointer, if I remember correctly. So this is going to be on it director data. And then I just want to cast that to a story graph. So that should push a story graph. That should push a story graph onto the machine. Brett, I don't know if you heard the conversation we were having or if you can see it, but DesDB was asking about what to get started, and I thought maybe you would have a better idea of what a beginner could learn first. I just have like 0 recommendations. I don't know if GameMaker is still good. I mentioned it, but I don't know if it's still good for beginners the way it was when I was on it, but I thought you might know. Hey, Dan. Yeah, I am kind of making a text adventure game engine. It is not really the endpoint I have in mind, but the text adventure is the simplest way to iterate on the part I do have in mind, which is the story engine. I think the story engine could be used in lots of genres, which I might have to demonstrate by making another game. But like, the story engine's kind of just a content processor, and like the idea of it is that it's a back-end editor and a runtime for your game. The easiest way to use it is through a text adventure, so that's how I'm getting started. But yeah, eventually I hope to show that this could be used on something that looks like a traditional game interface as well. But baby steps. Right, so when I push the graph, it does update the state of the stack right away. So it pushes the story graph onto the stack, and it sets the top of the stack state pointer to the initial state of the new graph. So all I have to do here is actually read off the top of the stack rather than write to it, right? The story machine push here already handled the stack. I just need to update my local iterator afterwards. And then graph pop. So this here Similarly, it's popping us off the graph. So it's managing everything I need to manage for the stack, but it's giving us, we need to update our local iterator by reading off the top of the stack still. Now that's all good, except we have to be careful because it's possible that right here, the stack could be empty. And if the stack is empty, then we need to stop instead of updating the iterator. And we might want to set the iterator to 0 as well. And so here, we only want to do this if it did not equal 0 at the end. If it equals 0 at the end, then that's kind of a bad state we got it into, where the stack is empty. And I might need some kind of developer fallback that's like, yo, problem, empty stack. This is you shouldn't be in this state. It means you have no story content for the system to run through. All right, so that should do most of the right things, but there is one thing it's not doing still that we need to think about. And this is where it gets a little interesting. So when we pop, we haven't handled the whole pop yet. So the pop has some data on it, remember? The director we created has this code in its data, this 32-bit code. And we need to do something with that. And what we're supposed to do with it depends on what kind of iterator we got right here, right? So we now need to do something like, this is where we might need a director function call like this. QU director no, there's not a lot of like Z machine inspiration in this. So I don't really know the details of how those things work. What I understand though is that there's well, I don't want to say too much because there's not a lot that I know. I understand that there's like a whole like virtual machine there and then ways to target that virtual machine, and I'm not really aware of how its internals were structured or what parts of the point and click adventure Infocom style games were like, how much of that genre was baked into Z machine versus how much was Z machine like an abstract bytecode thing just for moving games around, and it was like, was it partially baked into the Z machine and partially outside of it? I have no idea, like the architectural stuff there. So I couldn't really say anything about it, but my impression is that there's something about the Z machine that is tied in with the point and click adventure. And I can't really say, there's not a lot of point and click adventure inspiration in the way I'm thinking about this. I don't know that there might be really interesting ideas in there that I should be borrowing from. But this is much more from the interactive fiction angle than from the point and click adventure angle, as much as those can be considered different. Like it's just slightly different, like part of the space that I'm not as familiar with. Although I do like Thimbleweed Park. So there might be a case to be made that I should spend a little more time on point and click adventures that are of the higher quality ones, the good ones, than I have. Like Monkey Island and stuff like that. Maybe I should be getting into. But a big part of what I want is for the story to work. I want the story ideas to work within games that blend. I guess a big part of my vision here for these kinds of games is that I want games where game mechanics that aren't story game mechanics, like roguelike kinds of things, or strategy kinds of things, or platformer kinds of things, whatever, are on like an equal footing to the story the whole time. Like I'd love to see gameplay and storytelling. I'd love to see the gameplay feel like a part of the mechanics, and the mechanics to feel like it is running the storytelling on equal footing. And so Text Adventure is a nice starting point for that because it's abstract. It does not actually contain any opinion about what the gameplay is like. Like Text Adventure is almost an empty space that leaves open the structure of that kind of system leaves open enough space to plug in ideas and sit them side by side. Whereas a point and click adventure feels to me a little bit more like the space where a game could go is already filled up with a particular idea. But I could be wrong about that. Oh, Z Machine for Text Adventures 2. Yeah, like I said, I shouldn't say too much because it's a topic I don't know. I haven't spent a lot of time learning about the Z Machine, so I should refrain. Let's see, handle. We'll just call it handle because I don't. Any one of these could be called handle. This is handling init. This is handling cleanup. This is handling rendering. This is handling payload. Such a terrible name. Get result or receive result. Continue. Receive pop code. Handle pop code. Let's call it handle pop code. It's a little bit lame to put handle in the name of the function, but I can't think of a verb that implies handling a pop code without using the word handle. So this comes from the... Oh, I'm realizing I should probably save the original director up here because I'm going to change the iterator, and the director could be changing over time. Like I don't want to switch to referencing the new director while I'm still trying to process the original one, So that should be handling on that director. Oh no, we want to handle on after the pop. This is where it gets interesting. After the pop, the director on the node we popped to is the one doing the handling, but the director on the node we popped from is the one that contains the data that we need. Ain't that neat? That's how that has such virtual machine flavor to it. I love it. I don't like do pop a Brett because this isn't really doing the pop. The pop is already done. This is just handling some data that was associated with the pop. It's like a return code, and the return is already done, but the thing that got returned to needs to handle the data that came with the return. So I don't want it to imply that it does any of the popping. Okay, so that's good. But that's not all. And here's why that's not all. That only really makes sense. If this is a stop, right? So this is what you do if you have one of these procedure, like overloaded thingy things, right? So if this is a director with the stop kind, then you go into this path. But there's also a default path. There's a thing that happens if the director isn't one of these. And that thing that happens, so the thing we've just landed on, let's think this through. The node we've just landed on is one of two types of nodes, right? Either it's one of these stop nodes and it's got like a game loop inside of it. This is generating random events, or it's running combat loops, or whatever. If it's not a story, if it's not a text adventure anymore, then this node could be literally the thing that spawned off a level of platforming or something. But any of that is just content. It's a stop where the director took over with something other than a story graph. And then those things that take over with something other than a story graph have the option to push more story graphs on the stack procedurally, right? But the other option is that this is a graph push, like where we started. When you enter into town in the story that we're working on here, we don't want a whole director there. We just have an instruction that says do a graph push. And so it's possible that we pop back and find a stop. It's also possible that we pop back and find a graph push. And if we pop back and find a graph push, there's a default rule. And the default rule is that the code we got back is a path code. So why don't we do this? Let's grab this and call this the pop code. There's our pop code. And so now the pop code is going to be React pop code is pretty good. That's a good suggestion. React pop code. Yeah, I think I like that a little better. That implies that it's not a handle has this sort of meaning of an unsolved problem that needs to be handled, and that there's a specific way to handle it that someone needs to carry out. Whereas React has the idea of like the director could have its own world view and it's reacting to, like, it can react in whatever way it wants, but it gets this is its time to react to the pop code. I like that. Also, I prefer pop code over pop output. Pop code because I'm kind of using low level brain there, but I'm doing that very intentionally. I think low level brain is the correct brain for this particular thing because this data coming through is like opaque integer. It's an opaque integer being passed around from the graph's perspective. Yeah, the graph machine doesn't really know anything about why there's an integer. It just knows that some kind of code comes through here and goes out there and whatever, right? To me, something like pop code makes sense in that spot. Okay, director react to pop code if it's a stop type, but if it's a, I guess this could be a switch on what kind of director we popped to. Because we might end up with more director types that want to handle receiving their pop codes in other ways. Director kind, graph push. So if this was a graph push node, then it has a built-in default rule, which is that now we want to do this logic, right? This logic again. Okay, how are we going to do that? It's not that hard, it's just annoying. I could pull that out as a helper. I think we can get rid of set top now, which is good. I felt gross adding that in the first place. And then we replace that with, we got this for loop up here that I want to pull out. This is the for loop that says function QU story node, QU story machine select path. And so it takes in, technically it's taking in the node and outputting in a path and output code and outputting the new path node. I don't really want to have to Yeah, okay. I see what happened. not equal 0. Okay, good stack. It equals stack putter. Da, 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 da. We're going to put that in there. So yeah, this doesn't actually take in the story machine. It takes in a story node, so it probably isn't a story machine. This would be like story node select path or something like that. I don't know if there's a good place for that to live. These are for story construction. These are the director constructors. See, I think this just keeps living down here. I think it just keeps living down here because it fits in there, but it doesn't actually belong as like a story machine function because it does not operate on the machine directly. But that's fine. It's just a helper for the machine still. Pop up here, we're going to grab this for loop and make it a reusable helper. This is where we were talking earlier. I don't remember who I was explaining this to. Maybe I'll find it. Gobsmack Goose, if you're still around, this is where I was telling you like we could do some optimizations. If we at some point wanted to take this data structure and convert it into something high performance, you could imagine I take a compiler back in like LLVM or TB, and instead of generating a graph and a runtime virtual machine, I could imagine a world where you actually take one of these graphs and compile it into a DLL that is a part of your game. And so this would be something with the kind of thing that could completely vanish. And instead you'd have like a lookup table of like code comes in and then a state transition is just implemented right there inside the code at like as a jump or something like that. It looks like I might have lost internet for a minute, so I'm taking a moment to see if it comes back. It's just momentary, but it looks like the stream might have gone down. So I'm gonna watch for a moment. Maybe do a refresh over here. Let me know if you're in the stream and it's like you're hearing me again. It looks like I dropped for a moment and maybe it's back now. But I want to make sure because I can also reset the stream if we need to. I'm not hearing anyone yet. I don't know how long the delay is. Might need to be more patient. Everything looks good again. Okay. Cool. Awesome. So, let me finish up pulling this out. Node. We'll rename these to path. Path code equals path code. Result equals path. Select path. Result equals 0. Return result. Excellent. Now, we've got story node select path helper. Okay, so then we want to put in the current node and set next node equal to select the path current node path code. Okay, so that is just a refactor of the for loop that was there, and now we should be able to come down here and say if you are a graph push and we just popped back to you, then you pushed a stack. When we pop, we're popping to you the code that you should use to iterate at your level, right? So we were at one level, we popped with a certain path code. Yeah, we got a pretty long delay now, it sounds like. We were at one level, we popped and we sent a code down a level, and the code that comes down is an instruction to either the stop node to do whatever it wants to do, or to the push node to move forward on its level of the graph. Right, and then we need to, of course, make sure that we update the top of the stack with a new iterator. So this is all pretty good. There's something wrong here, and it's frustrating. I don't know exactly what to do with it, but this here needs to be more deeply integrated into the machine, but I don't know how to do it yet. And we don't have an example of this kind of thing yet. But the reason this is wrong is, like, it's very possible that this would want to have a similar effect to this. Like, say you're in a part of the game that's generating some random encounters, and its goal is to generate 3 random encounters, and it comes back with the result that you have succeeded on the 3rd random encounter, then it would then maybe want to go ahead and say, like, oh, well, then I'm going to implement transition into the next state in my level of the graph, the same way a graph push would have done. Like, the first couple of pop codes that come back tell it to advance its random encounter counter, but once the counter is at 3, it then goes, oh, I'm at 3, I should move forward in this graph, and yet it doesn't have any way to tell it that that's what should happen here. So that might be wrong and not fully integrated well enough, but I don't have an example of how it should actually work to make it any better. So that guess that we put in there, I'm just going to leave a note that's like, probably wrong or only half right. Something like that. Okay. Haha, makes sense. So you're only delayed because it like buffered up for you. Yeah. Probably wrong or only half right. Would want to be able to continue modifying machine state from inside this handler. Maybe send the code outside of the machine loop and then handle. Question mark? So, like, the idea here is maybe what I need to actually be doing is take this pop code and saying, oh, good, we're going to stop here. We're back on a stop. We're at the stop. So remember this pop code. When we return from all of this machine move stuff, go ahead and have the director do whatever it wants to do. And the director might then say, oh, I want to instantiate another round of machine moving. But that way it's outside of this one. We don't want our VM call, like, modifying itself within, like, we don't want a recursive call to the VM's processor function, right? The tick function of the VM should not have any recursive structure with itself. So we need some way to either integrate this in more deeply so it can communicate back to the VM, or export this out, extract this outside of the VM's loop, and that way it doesn't threaten to become recursive. Too many actual parameters. Oh, I guess I didn't write the path code parameter over here. Node Yeah, so this can just be it in this case. You also don't have your path code parameter. And then we need to implement this guy. Okay. Payload. All right, so if we got that, then we want to do React pop code. We're going to take the, we need to build the parameter block. Here's the code, param, right? And then we just pop in up here and say like, oh, in addition to all these things we already have, React pop code might be a thing. Okay. There we go. Okay, so to review, if it's all working, what should happen is we start the game, we're in the intro state, we see the pretty screen, right? We go in here, we never see the state because it immediately pushes a story graph called in town 1 story, which came from up here. So we arrive at the arrive state. And then we should get a choice of either tavern or library. Raises an interesting question. How is it going to render those to me? I think I have a function here for string from game move. Yeah. And it looks like, yep, look at this. I did not keep it up to date. I probably need to xlist the game move right now. Choose character, hire, search. Okay, so we have accept, reject, continue, sneak success, sneak fail, success, retreat, die. So those are all there. The only thing we don't have is tavern, library. Those that didn't make it in there, but that should be okay. So now it should give me the choice between a tavern and a library as paths I can choose. When I choose one of them, what should happen is I should go to another state. So I arrived at the arrive state, then I moved into one of these states through tavern or library. Finally, when I continue off of those, it'll take me to one of these states, which shouldn't ever actually appear. Instead, what should happen is that should cause the stack to pop immediately and send back this code, which would cause me to go into either the camp state, because I will go through the higher path, or the woods 1 state if I go through the search path, right? So let's see if it works or if we need to do some debugging. So here we go. Main screen still working. I go for riches and treasures. All right, so I have arrived at the arrive state. That is cool. So that means at least the stack push part worked, right? We never saw the in town 1. We went straight into the subgraph. We went straight into the smaller graph for the in town that got pushed on the stack. Now I'm going to go to the tavern. Now I'm in the tavern state and I want to continue. That's good. And then when I pop, I'm at camp. Okay, this was a great day. This is a works first time kind of day. That means we can spend a few minutes just sitting back and having a smile. Nice. Okay. So that was all I had planned for today, for the stream. So I need to think for a minute about what we might do next. I think that might wrap up. So the next big thing I really need to do. Let me tell you a little bit. I'll chat a bit, and then we'll then we'll wrap up. I think. Right, there's definitely some code that can be cleaned up, but the issue is that I can't quite decide how to clean it up yet. That's what I'm going to explain. So where I'm at now is I have this new ability to push these things on and pop them off from here. Now, there's a few things I don't know if they work yet, and I already pointed out one of them, which I don't know if this React pop code thing works. So I need to get to the point where I'm writing a piece of the game that has game logic that is not a story graph. Something like what would happen if you went into the dungeon, for instance. And if I start writing one of those, I might start finding other issues that I have, right? That's the kind of thing that would make heavy use of one of these, because that has its own separate logic from story graph, so it needs to initialize its own state, it needs to clean itself up, it needs to decide how to render itself in a unique way, it needs to... it might need to decide how to handle payloads, although I think I might be able to cut that one already. I'm pretty sure we can cut that one, but I'd rather leave the code there now, because if I start writing with this and I find I still need it, I would rather have it there to get it up and running. Even if it's like I'm still going to try to get rid of it, I want it just there because I don't want to have to keep unwriting it and rewriting it. And this one, it's like something along these lines is necessary, but maybe this is the wrong way to do it. Again, I would need to write a whole actual example of this. It's like real to start finding out why, like finding out what to do exactly with those issues. Similarly, I know that this definition pattern for story graphs is going to be annoying, and I'm gonna just have to live with the state path and these like the stop string, gr push, gr pop. These things I'm just gonna have to live with for now, because I'm not gonna go down the road of building a visual editor for these until I'm a little bit more satisfied with the idea that I can actually build a runtime for this that feels like it's got the properties I want. And I'm getting there. I think this was the right step forward, and it's a big step forward because I'm getting a better picture of that like virtual machine piece that allows me to use these story graphs to structure some things. And I would love to have a better way to edit these, that it might still be through these macros, but I could at least avoid like this dependency ordering stuff and get these outside of the main code file into their own isolated code files. And so I could start arranging how I want that to work. That might be something that's worth trying to do right now, I suppose. But I think... So there's two choices I can make. I could either start trying to fill in more real content. So I could, for instance, write a real path for the in-town thing that feels like it fully utilizes the system to tell the story a little better. And then maybe try to implement in-dungeon with guides here, right? And see how well that works. And if I started doing that first, I might find along the way some other stuff that I want to modify about like these macros and the structures of these things, and I would rather find out that kind of thing before I start spreading this out and isolating them, because as long as they're together, I can modify them, the core structure they're based on together. As soon as I start spreading them out, I can still do that, but once I spread them out, I've optimized for writing lots and lots of these, and that might be the right thing to do if my next goal is to write a lot of them to find an issue. But if I find an issue, then I'm going to want them all together again. So there's a little bit of a push and pull of what I should do next. But my gut feeling is that this is not overwhelming just yet. I could live with this a little longer without spreading these out and try to build out some more content into this graph and into these slots here. And once I've done that... I think it would be more interesting to talk about how I want to organize the story graphs while I'm still using this like hacked content system. So all of that to say, I think the right next move is to build a lot of content, and I'm not really feeling up for that right this minute. The first step for me building more content here would be to go for like an hour-long walk and think it through, and then come back and do some drawing. And like I said, maybe it'd be interesting to try to do that on stream someday, but my head's not really there. So I think I'm going to end it here. say thanks to everybody for coming and hanging out. If you don't know about my schedule, I'm streaming twice a week. On Monday, plus or minus a day. So today's plus a Monday plus one, and on Fridays plus or minus one. On Mondays, I do stuff like this. I work on my project. Sometimes it's going to be the StoryGraph stuff. I might also have some other projects that come up in here. But these are mostly things that I'm working on long term, like big projects that I'm going to spend a while iterating on. And just like building up my code base and stuff like that. And on Fridays, I do stuff that's more for fun. So I've been working on a mini sat thing for the last week, and I'll probably do that again sometime around Friday. It might not be on Friday this week. But sometime around then. And I'll do some other fun stuff there. I'm thinking maybe this week, I haven't decided yet, but maybe this week we'll try, instead of working on the SAT stuff, we might take another break from that and go download a roguelike that I like. So there's a couple that I have in mind, but I'm thinking Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup. Maybe we download the source code for that and try to build it and see if we can and play that game by building from source and start reading some code there, because I'm building a roguelike here ultimately, and I kind of feel like I benefit a lot from spending a little time playing around inside the code base of another roguelike. So that might be a fun project for this Friday or next Friday, or plus or minus a day. So there's that. And if you want to learn anything else about my projects, they're all somewhere here on MrForth.com. I've got my videos, I've got software stuff I've worked on. You can sign up for my newsletter and find out about projects earlier than anyone else. So that's stuff you can do. And I'm kind of feeling like it's probably a good time of day. Let's see if there's anybody doing any cool game dev on Twitch right now, and let's see. None of the things that are popping up as live immediately jump out to me, so I will skip it for today. It's much easier when there's a 7-day roguelike going on to find someone that I want to raid or something, but we'll skip that. Thanks for coming and hanging out, and I'll see you guys around.